Atlas had waited 13 Sundays for Caleb Rowe to stop, and on the 14th, the German shepherd decided he would not let the Marine walk past him again. Rain drifted across Camp Pendleton in thin silver sheets, softening the hard edges of the barracks and turning the chapel steps dark beneath the early morning sky. The base was unusually quiet. No shouted commands. No engines growling awake. Only the distant toll of the chapel bell and the steady whisper of water running through the gutters. Atlas sat at the bottom of the stone steps, his black and tan coat soaked along the shoulders, his amber eyes fixed on the narrow road leading from the enlisted housing. The chapel doors stood open behind him. Warm light spilled across the wet pavement, carrying the faint scents of candle wax, old wood, and fresh coffee. Atlas did not turn toward it. He never did. Every Sunday, he arrived before the first bell. Every Sunday, someone offered him food, shelter, or a dry place inside. And every Sunday, he refused. He simply watched the road as though waiting for a promise to come walking through the rain. Caleb Rowe appeared just after 7, moving with the measured stride of a man who still remembered how to march, but had forgotten where he was going. He was 36, tall and broad-shouldered, with pale skin weathered by years of sun and salt air. His short brown hair was damp beneath his cap, and the gray beneath his eyes spoke of nights when sleep came close but never stayed. Under one arm, he carried a small cardboard box softened at the corners by age. Inside were the last belongings of Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer, the man Caleb had trusted more than anyone in the world. Caleb had avoided the chapel since Daniel's memorial. He told himself the longer route to the administration building was more practical. No one challenged the lie. As he approached the steps, Atlas rose. Caleb slowed but did not stop. The dog moved into his path. Not aggressively. Not fearfully. He simply stood there, rain dripping from his ears, his gaze lowered toward the box. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured, shifting to the left. Atlas moved with him. Caleb tried the right. The dog blocked him again. For the first time, Caleb looked directly into those amber eyes. Something in them felt painfully familiar, not recognition exactly, but patience stretched across a great distance. Atlas leaned forward and touched his nose to the cardboard. From inside came the faint metallic sound of dog tags sliding against one another. The shepherd froze. His ears lifted. His breath caught in a soft, broken whine. Then he raised one paw and placed it carefully on the lowest chapel step. He looked at the open door, then back at Caleb. The bell rang again, deep and slow. Caleb's hand tightened around the box. "What are you waiting for?" he whispered. Atlas did not move. He had already given his answer. Caleb stood beneath the rain with the box pressed against his ribs, while Atlas waited beside the chapel steps as if silence itself had become a command. For several seconds, neither moved. Then the chapel doors opened wider, and a small group of Marines stepped out beneath the covered entryway. Their voices were low. Their uniforms were neat. One of them glanced toward Caleb, then quickly looked away. Everyone on the base knew what had happened to Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer. Fewer understood what the loss had done to Caleb Rowe. He had returned to duty 3 weeks earlier, but only in the technical sense. He reported on time. He completed every assignment. He answered questions with the fewest words possible. Yet something essential in him remained somewhere beyond reach, locked behind the same steady expression he wore through every inspection and briefing. At night, he slept in pieces. An hour here, 20 minutes there. Sometimes he woke with his hand closed around Daniel's dog tag so tightly that the metal left a red mark across his palm. The chaplain had invited him to talk. His commanding officer had offered leave. Caleb refused both. He was not angry with God. Anger would have required conversation, and Caleb had stopped speaking to heaven altogether. Atlas watched him now with a stillness that felt almost human. The German shepherd was large, perhaps 6 years old, with a dark saddle across his back and rain-darkened tan along his chest and legs. His ears remained alert, but his posture carried no threat. He looked trained, not merely obedient, but observant, the kind of dog that noticed a change in breathing before a person admitted they were afraid. No one seemed to know exactly where he came from. The gate guard said he appeared near the chapel shortly before dawn every Sunday. The kitchen staff had tried feeding him. The military police had checked for a tag. A handler from the canine unit had examined him and found the faded signs of old training, though no active record matched his markings. By Monday morning, Atlas was always gone. By the following Sunday, he returned. Caleb had seen him before, of course. Everyone had. The dog had become part of the chapel landscape, like the weathered cross above the doors or the row of white stones bordering the walkway. Caleb had never given him more than a passing glance. Grief had narrowed his world until only duty and memory remained. But now Atlas had heard the dog tags inside the box, and something had changed. "You know that sound," Caleb said quietly. Atlas lifted his head. Caleb crouched and set the box on the wet pavement. Inside lay Daniel's folded field cap, a worn leather notebook, 2 challenge coins, and the spare set of tags returned with his personal effects. Atlas leaned toward the opening. He inhaled once, sharply, then again more slowly. His body became rigid. A faint tremor moved through his shoulders. Caleb felt the air leave his lungs. "Daniel," he whispered. Atlas gave a low sound, not quite a whine, and turned his face toward him. The name had reached him. Caleb knew it. Before he could speak again, Atlas stepped away from the box, climbed 1 chapel step, and looked back. Then he lifted his right paw and tapped the stone 3 times, slow and deliberate. Caleb stared at him. Somewhere inside the chapel, a hymn began softly. Atlas waited, his amber eyes fixed on Caleb, as though the next move had always belonged to him. Caleb remained crouched beside the open box, listening to the hymn drift through the chapel doors while rain gathered along the brim of his cap. Atlas tapped the stone once more, then lowered his paw and waited. 3 measured knocks. Not random, not restless, deliberate. Caleb knew that rhythm. Daniel used to tap it against the side of transport trucks before long movements. 3 soft beats to tell the men closest to him that he was ready. It had become a private joke between them, a signal born from too many early mornings and too much bad coffee. Caleb had not heard it since the last deployment. His gaze moved from Atlas to the spare dog tags inside the box. "Who taught you that?" he asked. The dog stepped down, touched his nose to Daniel's folded field cap, and looked toward the narrow path running along the side of the chapel. Caleb did not follow. Not yet. He closed the box and carried it back to his room, telling himself the moment had been coincidence shaped by grief. By the next Sunday, the rain had cleared. The sky above the base was pale blue, and the morning air smelled of eucalyptus, cut grass, and coffee drifting from the dining facility. Caleb took the longer road again, but this time he wore Daniel's old field jacket over his uniform. He had found it beneath the cap, folded tightly at the bottom of the box. The sleeves were slightly too short, and one pocket still held a peppermint wrapper Daniel had forgotten. Caleb noticed Atlas before Atlas noticed him. The German shepherd sat in the same place, calm and watchful. Then the wind shifted. Atlas turned sharply. He crossed the walkway in a straight line and pressed his nose against the jacket near Caleb's left hip. His tail did not wag. His breathing changed, quick at first, then slow, as though he were sorting through layers of scent and memory. Caleb felt the dog's warm breath through the fabric. Atlas looked up, and for one brief second, the guarded strength in his face disappeared. What remained was recognition. Caleb stepped back. Atlas followed 1 pace, then stopped. "Daniel wore this," Caleb said. The name pulled a quiet whine from the dog's throat. It was softer than the chapel bell, but it struck deeper. Caleb turned away before anyone could see his expression. A week passed. On the 3rd Sunday, he arrived before the first service and found Atlas waiting beside the white stones along the walkway. Caleb stood 20 feet away, unsure why he had come. Perhaps he wanted proof. Perhaps he wanted the strange connection to fail so he could return to the safer belief that nothing meant anything. Without thinking, he placed 2 fingers between his lips and whistled 3 descending notes. Daniel's recall signal. Atlas rose at once. His ears sharpened. He crossed the distance so quickly that Caleb barely had time to breathe. The dog stopped directly in front of him, eyes bright, body trembling with restrained urgency. Then Atlas turned toward the chapel's side entrance. He walked halfway there, looked back, and waited. Caleb stayed where he was. Atlas returned, nudged Caleb's right hand, and moved away again. The hand was closed so tightly that his nails pressed into his palm. "I am not going in there," Caleb said. Atlas did not lead him to the open doors. Instead, he continued past them toward a narrow path behind the building, where tall hedges hid the old memorial garden from view. Chaplain Elias Ward stood beneath the covered entryway, watching in silence. He was a broad, silver-haired man with a gentle face and the patient posture of someone who had learned not to interrupt sorrow. Caleb looked toward him. Does he do this with anyone else? The chaplain shook his head. No, then what does he want? Elias watched Atlas waiting at the edge of the hidden path. Some dogs remember commands, he said. Others remember promises. Atlas tapped one paw against the pavement 3 times, then turned toward the garden once more. Caleb watched Atlas disappear beyond the hedge, then glanced once at Chaplain Elias Ward before following. The path behind the chapel was narrow and damp from the previous week's rain, bordered by rosemary bushes and pale stones worn smooth by years of weather. The sounds of the bass faded with every step. Engines became distant murmurs. Voices softened. Even the chapel bell seemed farther away, as though the garden existed in a quieter part of the world. Atlas moved slowly now. He was no longer urging Caleb forward. He seemed certain Caleb would not turn back. At the end of the path stood a low brick wall lined with bronze plaques, each one bearing a name, a rank, and a date. Small American flags had been placed beneath several of them. Some were fresh. Others had faded under the California sun. Atlas stopped before the 3rd plaque from the end. He sat. Caleb knew the name before he read it. Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer. The letters were clean and dark against the bronze. Beneath them, someone had left a single challenge coin and a sprig of dried rosemary. Caleb felt the familiar pressure gather behind his ribs. So this was it. Atlas had belonged to Daniel. The dog had been returning to the place where his handler was remembered, waiting for a man who would never walk through the chapel doors again. The answer was painful, but simple. Caleb almost welcomed its simplicity. You should have told me, he said without turning around. Elias had followed at a respectful distance. I did not know how much you already understood. I understood nothing. Caleb's voice remained quiet, but the words carried an edge. This dog has been sitting out there for weeks. Atlas lowered himself beneath Daniel's plaque and rested his chin on his paws. He has been waiting, Caleb continued. And everyone just let him. We gave him shelter, Elias said. He left every time. Then someone should have made him stay. Elias looked toward Atlas. Perhaps staying was not what he was trying to do. Caleb turned sharply. He knew Daniel. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Caleb looked back at the plaque, and grief hardened into something easier to carry. Anger. Then why was he not listed with Daniel's effects? Why was there no record? Why did nobody call me? Elias reached inside his coat and removed a worn leather collar. The brown surface was cracked along the edges, and the brass buckle had dulled with age. A narrow metal capsule was fixed beneath the strap. Because this arrived 2 days ago, Elias said. It was recovered with equipment that had been delayed in transfer. Caleb took the collar. The leather was cold in his hand. Atlas lifted his head, but did not approach. Caleb turned the tag toward the morning light. One side bore a single name, Atlas. On the other side, beneath several deep scratches, were 4 words engraved in block letters. Return to Caleb Rowe. For a moment, the garden lost all sound. Caleb read the words again. Then once more, slower. That is not possible. Elias said nothing. Daniel never told me about a dog. Caleb's thumb moved over his own name. I had never seen Atlas before the memorial. The metal capsule beneath the collar was bent and sealed tightly, as though it had been crushed long ago. Caleb tried to twist it open, but it would not move. Atlas stood and came closer. He touched his nose to the capsule, then looked directly at Caleb. There was no confusion in his eyes. No hesitation. Only the patient certainty of an animal that had finally reached the person he had been searching for. Caleb closed his fingers around the collar. Why would Daniel send him to me? Elias looked toward the bronze plaque and answered softly. That is the part no one here knows. Caleb carried the collar to the maintenance shop near the Eastern Motor Pool, with Atlas walking beside him and Elias following several paces behind. The morning sun had burned through the clouds, leaving the pavement bright and damp. Inside the shop, the air smelled of machine oil, warm metal, and old canvas. Chief Warrant Officer Samuel Pike looked up from a workbench when Caleb entered. Pike was a careful man in his late 50s, with silver hair, square glasses, and hands that treated every damaged object as though it still had something important to say. Caleb placed the collar beneath the bench light. Can you open this without destroying what is inside? Pike examined the bent capsule and nodded slowly. I can try. Atlas sat near Caleb's left boot, watching every movement. The small cutting wool never touched the capsule itself. Pike worked around the damaged seam with thin tools, patient pressure, and the concentration of a man defusing memory rather than metal. While they waited, Elias opened a weathered transfer folder recovered with the collar. Most of the pages were routine supply records, but one handwritten statement bore Daniel Mercer's signature. The ink had faded, though his words remained clear. Daniel first encountered Atlas during a humanitarian evacuation near a remote field station overseas. The German Shepherd had been separated from a local security team during a chaotic relocation. Frightened, dehydrated, and wearing a damaged working collar, Atlas refused food from everyone except Daniel. For 3 days, Daniel shared his water, slept beside him, and spoke to him as if they had served together for years. Caleb could hear Daniel's voice in the report, even through the formal language. Practical, calm, always finding room for mercy where others saw only delay. Atlas recovered quickly and began following Daniel through every routine. He waited outside briefings. He walked beside supply vehicles. He responded to the 3-note whistle Daniel had used with his own Marines. He taught him the signal, Caleb said. Elias nodded. The report continued. Daniel had requested temporary custody of Atlas until the dog could be returned to a stateside rehabilitation program. In the margin, written in darker ink, was a note not meant for official review. Ro will pretend he is fine until he disappears inside himself. This dog notices what people miss. Caleb stopped reading. The room seemed suddenly too small. He remembered a night months earlier when he and Daniel had sat outside their quarters beneath a sky crowded with stars. Caleb had admitted that silence sometimes felt safer than coming home. Daniel had not offered advice. He had only listened. Apparently, he had remembered. Pike's tool made a soft click. I have it, he said. The capsule opened by less than half an inch. Inside was a tightly rolled piece of waterproof paper and one small fragment of a photograph. Caleb recognized the picture immediately. It had once shown him and Daniel standing beside an aircraft hangar, both squinting into the sun, Daniel laughing at something Caleb could no longer remember. Only Daniel's half remained inside the capsule. On the back, in his handwriting, were 3 words. Find the other half. Caleb stared at the message. Elias turned another page in the folder and found a final transfer request dated the morning before Daniel's unit departed. Atlas was to be delivered directly to Caleb Rowe upon return. Reason for placement: long-term companionship and recovery support. Caleb's throat tightened. He planned this before he knew he was not coming back. Atlas rose and pressed gently against Caleb's leg. Pike unfolded the waterproof paper, but the inner writing remained hidden beneath another sealed fold. Caleb reached for it, then stopped. His hand began to tremble. The message had crossed thousands of miles to find him. Now that it was finally within reach, he was not certain he could bear the voice waiting inside. Caleb kept his hand above the folded paper without touching it. The maintenance shop had gone quiet around him. Even the small fan near Pike's workbench seemed to turn more softly, stirring the scent of oil and warm dust through the room. Atlas remained pressed against Caleb's leg, steady and silent, as though he understood that the last few inches between Caleb and the message were harder to cross than any road. Elias did not hurry him. Neither did Pike. Caleb looked down at the fragment of the photograph. Daniel's half showed the edge of a smile, one shoulder, and the bright California sky behind him. Caleb knew where the other half was. He had carried it inside his wallet since the day Daniel gave him the picture, years before either of them imagined that memory could become evidence of a promise. Slowly, Caleb reached into his back pocket and removed the worn leather wallet. The photograph was tucked behind his military identification card, creased through the center and faded at the corners. His half showed his own face, turned slightly toward Daniel, trying not to laugh. When he placed the 2 pieces together beneath the bench light, the image became whole again. Atlas leaned forward and touched his nose to Daniel's side of the picture. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment. Then he unfolded the waterproof paper. The handwriting inside was small and uneven, written quickly but clearly enough to read. Caleb, you are going to blame yourself. Do not. You always carry the part no one asked you to carry. Atlas knows the way home. Follow him. Beneath the message was a rough sketch of the chapel, the memorial garden, and the barracks road, along with 3 marked points connected by a line. The first was Daniel's plaque. The second was the side entrance to the chapel. The third was Caleb's quarters. Caleb studied the drawing, confused. He mapped the base for the dog. Pike said softly. Elias shook his head. Not exactly. Look at the dates. Beside each point, Daniel had written a Sunday. The first date matched the memorial service. The second fell 1 week later. The final date had been left blank. Caleb felt a slow realization move through him. Daniel had expected Atlas to begin at the place carrying his scent, then search the paths Caleb used, week after week, until the dog found him. The chapel was not the destination. It was the starting point. He was not waiting for Daniel, Caleb said. His voice barely rose above the hum of the fan. Elias looked toward Atlas. No, he was waiting for you. Caleb read the message again. You always carry the part no one asked you to carry. The words opened something he had kept sealed beneath routine and exhaustion. Daniel had known him too well. He had known Caleb would turn survival into guilt, silence into punishment, and absence into a room with no door. Atlas had crossed that silence patiently, one Sunday at a time. The dog had followed Daniel's scent to the memorial, Caleb's scent to the chapel steps, and grief itself to the man standing before him now. Caleb lowered himself to one knee. Atlas met him without hesitation. The German shepherd placed one paw beside the joined photograph and rested his head against Caleb's chest. Caleb's hand settled between the dog's ears. You found me, he whispered. Atlas exhaled slowly. Elias turned away, giving them the privacy sorrow sometimes requires. Caleb looked once more at Daniel's final instruction. Follow him. Then Atlas lifted his head, walked toward the shop door, and glanced back. Outside, the road led in the direction of the chapel. This time, Caleb did not make him wait. Atlas led Caleb back across the base beneath a sky washed clean by morning light. The German shepherd did not pull ahead. He kept an even pace, close enough that Caleb could hear the soft rhythm of his breathing and the muted strike of his paws against the pavement. Pike remained at the shop. Elias followed only as far as the chapel walkway, then stopped beneath the shade of an old eucalyptus tree. The bells had gone silent. The last service had ended, leaving the grounds nearly empty. Atlas turned toward the memorial garden. Caleb followed him past the rosemary bushes and pale stones until Daniel's bronze plaque came into view. The challenge coin still rested beneath it. So did the dried sprig someone had left days before. Atlas sat in the same place as before, but this time Caleb did not remain standing. He lowered himself onto the damp stone border beside the dog. For a while, he said nothing. The words inside Daniel's message moved through him slowly, finding every place he had tried to seal shut. You are going to blame yourself. Do not. Caleb reached into his wallet and removed the repaired photograph. He placed it beside the challenge coin, joining the two halves one final time. You knew, he said, looking at Daniel's name. You knew exactly what I would do. His voice was steady at first. You knew I would come back, report for duty, answer every question, and pretend that was the same as living. Atlas shifted closer. Caleb's right hand tightened around Daniel's dog tag. The metal pressed into his palm. He had held it that way for weeks, as if pain could keep memory from fading. I heard you call my name, he whispered. The garden seemed to grow still around him. I heard you, and I kept moving because you told me to get the others home. His breath caught, but he continued. You made it sound simple, like an order, like I could obey it and not spend every night wondering whether I had left part of myself behind. Atlas leaned his shoulder against Caleb's knee. Caleb looked down at the dog. Those amber eyes held no accusation, only attention, only the patience Daniel had somehow trusted before Caleb ever met him. I should have gone back, Caleb said. Atlas lifted one paw and placed it gently over Caleb's closed fist. The contact was light, but Caleb froze. The dog did not scratch or push. He simply kept his paw there, waiting. Caleb's fingers began to loosen. First one, then another. The dog tag lay in the center of his open palm, its edges marked by the pressure of his grip. Atlas lowered his nose and touched the metal once. Then he rested his head beneath Caleb's hand. Something inside Caleb gave way. Not loudly, not all at once. His shoulders bowed, and the breath he had been holding for weeks left him in a broken exhale. Tears came without warning, warm against the cool air. He did not hide them. There was no one here to impress, no formation to hold, no report to complete. Only a man, a dog, and the name of someone they both missed. Caleb bent forward until his forehead rested against Atlas's. The shepherd stayed perfectly still. "I am sorry," Caleb whispered. "I am sorry it took me 13 Sundays." Atlas breathed against him, slow and steady. Behind them, the chapel door opened with a soft wooden sigh, but neither turned. Elias stood at the edge of the path and watched without speaking. Caleb finally understood why. Some grief could not be corrected. It could only be witnessed. Some guilt did not loosen through argument. It loosened when another living soul refused to leave. After several minutes, Caleb sat upright and wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. Atlas remained pressed against his side. Caleb looked at Daniel's name once more, then closed his hand around the dog tag without squeezing. "All right," he said softly. "Show me the way home." Atlas stood, but he did not walk toward the chapel. He turned instead toward the road leading to Caleb's quarters, then looked back to make certain Caleb was coming. Atlas walked beside Caleb all the way to the barracks, never more than a few feet from his left side. The road was quiet beneath the late morning sun, and the damp pavement gave off the clean scent of rain and warm concrete. Caleb unlocked the door to his quarters and paused with his hand on the frame. The room beyond was orderly in the way lonely places often are. One chair, one narrow bed, one cup beside the sink. No photographs on the walls. No sound except the low hum of the air conditioner. Atlas waited at the threshold. He did not enter until Caleb stepped aside. "Come on," Caleb said. The German shepherd crossed the doorway slowly, sniffed the floor, then circled once near the foot of the bed before settling there, as though he had finally reached a post assigned long ago. That first night, Caleb woke just after 2 in the morning with his heart racing and the room dark around him. For several seconds, he did not know where he was. Then he heard Atlas breathing near the door. The dog lifted his head but did not move closer. He simply watched until Caleb's breathing slowed. By sunrise, Atlas was still there. In the days that followed, nothing changed quickly. Caleb still woke before dawn. He still carried Daniel's dog tag in his pocket. He still avoided certain questions. But he began to eat breakfast in the dining facility instead of alone. Atlas lay beneath the table while Marines came and went around them. Caleb returned to the counseling appointment he had canceled twice. He did not say much during the first session, but he stayed until the end. That mattered. Atlas seemed to understand routines before Caleb created them. At 5 each morning, he waited beside the door. At noon, he rested beneath Caleb's desk. In the evening, he carried a worn canvas ball from one side of the room to the other until Caleb finally threw it. The first time Caleb laughed, the sound surprised him. Atlas froze, ears lifted, then bounded after the ball with an energy that made Caleb laugh again. A week later, Caleb completed the paperwork to become Atlas's permanent handler and caretaker. The clerk slid the final form across the counter and smiled. "Looks like he already made the decision for you." Caleb glanced down at Atlas. He usually does. Sunday arrived under a bright California sky. The chapel bell rang across the base, deep and familiar. Caleb stood outside his quarters with Daniel's collar in one hand and Atlas beside him. Together they walked the same road Atlas had traveled alone for 13 weeks. At the chapel steps, Atlas stopped. The doors were open. Warm light stretched across the stone. Caleb rested his hand on the brass handle, but did not pull. Memories gathered close, not sharp enough to wound, but heavy enough to slow him. Atlas did not tug. He did not step ahead. Instead, he moved until his shoulder touched Caleb's leg and waited beside him. Equal, present, patient. Caleb looked down at him. "You are not going to make this easy, are you?" Atlas blinked once. Caleb drew a long breath and opened the door. The scent of old wood, candle wax, and coffee met them. A few heads turned, then respectfully faced forward again. Elias stood near the front and gave the smallest nod. Caleb stepped inside. Atlas entered at the same moment, neither leading nor following. They chose the last row. Caleb sat, and Atlas settled beneath the bench with his head resting on Caleb's boot. When the first hymn began, Caleb did not sing. Not yet. But he remained. For the first time since Daniel's memorial, the chapel did not feel like a place where someone had been taken from him. It felt like a door he had finally crossed with someone willing to stay. Months passed, and the California mornings grew warmer. The eucalyptus trees along the chapel road turned silver beneath the sun, and the bass settled into the familiar rhythm of drills, engines, footsteps, and distant bells. On Sundays, the stone steps were no longer marked by a solitary German shepherd staring down an empty road. Atlas walked beside Caleb now. Sometimes they arrived early. Sometimes they sat in the last row. Sometimes Caleb remained outside for several minutes with one hand resting between Atlas's ears before finding the strength to enter. No one rushed him. Healing had not made him forget Daniel. It had simply changed the weight of remembering. The dog tag no longer left marks in his palm. Caleb wore it on a chain beside his own, where the two pieces of metal touched softly when he walked. Daniel's repaired photograph rested in a simple frame on the desk in his quarters. Atlas's old collar hung beneath it. The words returned to Caleb Rowe, facing outward. One Sunday morning, Chaplain Elias stepped outside before the service and found the chapel steps empty. For a moment, he looked toward the road out of habit. Then he heard the quiet movement of paws against the wooden floor behind him. Caleb was already inside, seated near the back with Atlas lying at his feet. Sunlight passed through the stained glass and scattered blue, red, and gold across the aisle. Caleb's face was calm, though not untouched by sorrow. Some losses never leave. They become part of the way a person sees the light. When the final hymn ended, Marines began filing toward the doors. Caleb remained seated while Atlas lifted his head and watched them pass. Near the front, a young corporal sat alone with his shoulders bowed and his hands closed tightly together. Everyone else moved around him, not from indifference, but from the uncertainty people feel when they recognize pain they do not know how to approach. Caleb noticed. So did Atlas. The dog rose without command and walked down the aisle. He stopped beside the young Marine, waited, then lowered himself onto the floor near his boots. The corporal looked down. His expression shifted with surprise, then softened. One hand slowly reached toward Atlas's fur. Caleb stood and followed. He did not ask what had happened. He did not offer advice. He sat on the end of the bench, leaving enough space for silence. For several minutes, the three of them stayed there beneath the colored light. At last, the young Marine spoke. His voice was low and uncertain. Caleb listened. Atlas rested his head against the corporal's knee, patient as ever. Outside, the bell rang once, deep and gentle, carrying across the base. Elias watched from the doorway and understood that Daniel's final promise had traveled farther than anyone expected. Atlas had found Caleb. Caleb had found his way back. Now, together, they had become the ones who noticed when another soul was disappearing quietly. Grace had not arrived as an answer. It had arrived as a dog waiting beside a closed door, refusing to leave until a grieving man was ready to stop. And after that man finally did, he learned the same sacred kindness. Sometimes the smallest act of mercy is simply staying long enough for someone else to believe they are not alone.